You are listening to the Cycling Podcast in association with Rapha, the fastest clothing in the world tour, the home of cycling with character. Ride and watch with Rapha in 2019 as they partner EF Education First and Canyon SRAM.
Where are we, Lionel?
Well, we are in London, Richard, outside our home venue, the Vermuteria, in London's King's Cross.
It's busy, nice in the sunshine, isn't it? And where are you, Daniel Fried?
I'm on my way, so to speak, to Brussels. I'm in the Mosel Valley in Germany. I'm sort of meandering my way towards Belgium and the Tour de France. Yeah, being overlooked by some of the steepest vineyards in the world, drinking a nice glass of Riesling. Yeah.
Flaneuring. Picking a few daffodils.
Yeah, international man of mysterying.
Sorry, flaneuring.
Yeah.
Wow, I just imagine him arriving in Brussels with a daisy chain round his wrist that picked from the German hillsides.
This is all very topical.
In honour of Warren Barguil.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Top flaneuring from Warren Barguil, wasn't it?
That was a terrific race, the French National Road Race Championship. Barguil, I'm sort of. This is a bit of a spoiler alert for your news roundup, Lionel, which I'm sure is just around the corner. But Barguil, Guillaume Martin had a go. He had a decent gap, looked like he might get it, and then the group came back together. There were two Cofidis riders there. They set it up well, but Barguil came from the back, and he's, for such a spindly little fella with legs like dandelion stalks, he's a good finisher, isn't he? And he's a fast rider, and he's good at winning races. We've seen that before. He can win from little groups like that.
But is there a modern rider whose performances sort of more widely straddle the extremes of awful and awesome? More than Barguil, I'm not sure. I mean,
Fabio Aru.
Yeah, kind of similar. Buff, this might be a bit lost on you, but he sort of reminds me. Well, I kind of feel he's the cycling equivalent of Faustino Asprilla, the Colombian footballer who was.
That's not lost on me.
It's not lost. He played in a very similar vein for Newcastle and Parma in the 90s. He either looked like sort of Sunday League or Champions League.
Half expecting Barguil to get off his bike and do a windmill handstand celebration on that basis.
Yeah, he's a bit of a Juan Sebastian Veron, isn't he?
Showing
Warren
his
Barguil.
knowledge now.
You like that?
Yeah.
You like that?
The avalanche of emails complaining about football references on the eve of the tour will send morale dipping, Richard, at this rate.
Anyway, I was delighted to see Barguil win, and I think that's probably just the boost he needs ahead of the Tour de France. And I hope we see him back to his best there, because he's a very exciting rider to watch.
He's going to look great in the champions jersey,
he'll
isn't
do that justice, won't he? I'm sure.
The tricolour will look magnificent on his coat hanger frame.
As he gets dropped at La Planche des Belles Filles, it's going to look magnificent.
It'll help the French TV cameras pick him out, that's for sure.
And in all
Lionel, sorry, Daniel.
Seriousness as well with Barguil. I mean, I've noticed over the last couple of years that he's really he kind of seems sort of brutalized by the whole experience of the last 2 or 3 years. And we knew him, as everyone got to know him, as this, well, as we called him, this whimsical flaneur whose naivety was very charming. Somewhere put out videos of him roller skating with his girlfriend, and he was this guy who didn't want to move to Monaco because he wanted to be near his grandmother in Brittany, and it was all very charming. And in the last sort of year or so, I've had this real sense when I've seen him at races that he's kind of been chewed up and spat out, and he doesn't really want to speak a whole lot to the media anymore, and has been quite sort of frosty, really. And this happens to, I suppose, a lot of young riders who are hyped up and then don't live up to the false expectations that we in the media create. But I think that's definitely been the case with Barguil. It's been a steep, rough learning curve for him.
And possibly, well, he was sent home from the Vuelta by Team Sunweb, wasn't he, after failing to observe team orders in 2017, wasn't he? He didn't want to wait for his teammate, kind of looked the other way, and he was already moving teams, wasn't he? And he's kind of moved sideways and slightly downwards, and yet has that extra burden of being a team leader for Arkea Samsic. So
we should say that this is a press conference episode that we're doing. I mean, it's not a Barguil special. We're going to move on in a moment, but we're going to be playing some of our listeners' questions in this episode as we look ahead to the Tour de France, and we should get on to them, but there is a bit of news, one piece of news in particular that we should discuss first. So Lionel, could you?
Well, yeah, it's a very big item of news that broke today with the announcement of Dimension Data's 8-man team for the Tour de France, and the news that Mark Cavendish is not in their selection. Now, one of you, I can't remember who asked me this last week, whether if I was Doug Ryder, would I take Cavendish to the Tour de France, and I got splinters in my bottom sitting on the fence because I could see both cases, the case for taking him and the case for leaving him. And it's today, now that he's not in that lineup, that I can see the strength of the case to have taken him, which is very well. That's pretty whimsical of me, really. I'm trying to have it always there, but it does mean that Mark Cavendish won't be in the Tour de France. He's ridden every year since 2007. He has been stuck on 30 stage wins for a couple of years now. He hasn't finished the last 3 tours that he started, and he is probably one of the biggest names to just be left out of his team's lineup. I can't think of anyone else who's just been omitted. And if this is the end of his Tour de France career, it's a pretty blunt way for it to come to a close, really. Not even mentioned in the initial kind of team press release, and then kind of mentioned belatedly in dispatches as a kind of a social media tide. Lapped at the feet of Dimension Data, kind of saying, well, hang on, the guy has won 30 Tour de France stages and perhaps does deserve a bit of a mention for not being picked. And it's already emerged that Rolf Aldag, the sports director, batted for Cavendish's inclusion, and Doug Ryder, the team boss, made the final call and decided to go with, we gather, the choice came down to Steve Cummings or Mark Cavendish. Daniel, do you have any additional information on Cavendish's omission at the moment?
Well, I think obviously he'll be disappointed, quite angry maybe. It was uncertain, certainly last week. I think there was a conference call between Cavendish and the management late last week, in which Cavendish stated his case pretty forcefully, and Rolf Aldag argued his corner as well. Aldag, of course, has been a big ally of Cavendish's since his HTC days. And, we talked last week about Cavendish not having achieved the results that he wanted to achieve in the build-up to the race. The Tour of Slovenia didn't go brilliantly. However, I know he felt great on the last stage. He didn't contest the sprint. He actually got dropped on a climb in the finale, but he felt that he really turned a corner there. And he's felt that he's turned a few corners recently when he trained at altitude a few weeks ago in Isola 2000, and he trained with some of the INEOS riders, and he took some ideas from them about how he should maybe modify his training. I mean, I mentioned last week he's changed a lot of things this year. He's tried different things, altitude, different types of training, and we haven't really seen the fruit of that yet, but he felt that it was coming. And I haven't spoken to him since the weekend. I don't know what effect his performance in the British National Championships had on the decision that Dimension Data made, or Doug Ryder made. Ultimately, on paper, it didn't look a great result. Certainly on a flat course, he was sort of surrounded by riders who are not World Tour riders and far from it. So that probably didn't help his cause. Another thing that didn't help his cause was the experience of last year. He went to the Tour de France not with great results behind him last year. He was ill. We found out later he still had the Epstein-Barr virus. But it was a pretty fractious atmosphere at Dimension Data at the Tour de France last year. There was a big argument on the team bus on about day 2 or 3 about how hard they were going to ride in the team time trial, whether they should be saving themselves or not. And his relationship with Doug Ryder, I think, really deteriorated from that point, and they patched things up again and were able to work together for the first few months of this year, but it's never been fully repaired. And I think maybe the memory of that Tour de France last year and how it felt like a disaster for the whole team with Cavendish there was something that Doug Ryder really wanted to avoid this time around. And I think, as well as the lack of results, that probably did not play in Cavendish's favour, and that might have been ultimately what has led to this decision today.
I think that hits the nail on the head, that we judge the decision purely on the basis of results or potential results, and we can't really factor in what it does to the internal dynamics of the team, the chemistry in the team. And Cavendish is such a big personality, and he is, he can be quite abrasive and very kind of forceful.
But he can also be great in a team environment, can't he, Rich?
Oh yeah. No, I'm not painting him in a negative light at all. I think he's a big character, and I think he probably sets the tone. And I think perhaps if you get on the wrong side of Cavendish, we all know what that's like. And in a team situation, there may just be risks associated with that in Doug Ryder's mind that we don't fully understand or can fully appreciate. And that might be as much of a factor as his perceived ability to get a result, to be up there in the sprint.
One thing I'll just add, some people will look at Nizzolo's inclusion and maybe assume that it was either or. They were going to take one sprinter and it was either going to be Nizzolo or Cavendish. Certainly from Cavendish's point of view, that wasn't the case. He and Nizzolo had an agreement and understanding that Cavendish would be the man on flatter days, and Nizzolo would be able to get over climbs better than Cavendish, as was the case in Slovenia, and they would work fine together. So it wasn't an either or between those two.
What about the fact that had Cavendish just slotted into that team, you'd be struggling to pick much of a lead-out train? I mean, obviously, Lars Bak can do lots of chasing and getting towards the sort of final 10 kilometres, but you wouldn't sacrifice Edvald Boasson-Hagen too much on the altar of Mark Cavendish's sprinting ambitions, maybe. Although, having said that, it's really only the Saturday, the Monday and the Tuesday, isn't it, of the first week, the kind of the cast iron sprint opportunities. Maybe an opportunity on Friday as well in the first week, but then there's maybe one sprint stage in Toulouse in the second week, and then Paris. I mean, you would be picking Mark Cavendish for a small handful of opportunities and pretty much nothing else, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, we mentioned this last week, didn't we, that one victory certainly would make Dimension Data's tour. And if that came on the first day, that would be fine. And if it was with Cavendish, it would be a fantastic story. I think there was talk about them wanting sort of guarantees that Cavendish would get to Paris, but I don't really see the logic in that. It wouldn't have added a great deal, him being another name among the finishers in Paris. I think they're in the business of stage wins, and they've had a few reasons for cheer recently, but really they haven't had a great season, and a stage win would turn that season around, and it would make their season. So I don't think that was too much of a concern. And obviously, Bernie Eisel has also been kind of jettisoned. Eisel has been part of the Cavendish support team for a long time, and he wouldn't have gone with a big lead-out train. But I think he's realistic enough to know that he couldn't demand a big lead-out train at this point, with the results that he's had over the last couple of years and the problems he's had. He was never going to go in with 4 riders supporting him. I think he would have been very happy to be sort of the eighth name on the team sheet, and very much an outsider for those first couple of sprints.
Well, Cavendish will miss the Tour, and the Tour will miss Cavendish, I think. The 50th anniversary of Eddie Merckx's first victory, and that 34 stage win record being, well, out of reach, really, I would have said now. But there we are. That's the big pre-tour news. I was just going to wrap up a little bit. I wasn't going to run through every national championship result with a mini race report. Rich will be here all day if I do that. But as you mentioned, Warren Barguil won the French road race championships, and some of the other results that caught my eye were, well, the outstanding performance of Bora Hansgrohe across Europe. They've got 6 new national titles, or 6 national titles won by their riders. So their kit man will be very busy in the next couple of days, getting all the national champions jerseys ready. Maciej Bodnar won the Polish time trial championships for them. Davide Formelo's the Italian road race champion. Sam Bennett won in Ireland. Juraj Sagan won in Slovakia. Patrick Conrad in Austria, and Max Schachmann in Germany. So a real
1, 2, 3 in Germany for Bora Hansgrohe as well.
That's right. De Koning Quickstep close behind with 5 national title wins. Kasper Asgreen won the Danish time trial, and Michael Murku won the road race. Bob Jungels did the double in Luxembourg, and Fabio Jakobsen won the Dutch road race. What else? What else should I mention? Cyclocross riders did very well in the road championships in Belgium. Wout van Aert won the time trial, and Tim Merlier won the road race. Ben Swift won the British road race. Alex Dowsett will be riding for Katusha, the new British time trial champion.
Ben Swift must have been quite close to the Tour de France team for INEOS. I would have thought rode very well in Switzerland. And another very popular win there, because he had a terrible crash early in the season. He had a couple of really bad seasons with UAE Team Emirates. The irony being that had he been on any team other than INEOS, he'd have probably been in the Tour team this year, showing off the national champions jersey. But very popular win that, because Ben Swift has had a lot of bad luck, a lot of bad injuries, and certainly a really bad crash this year. So good to see him back.
Alejandro Valverde won't be wearing the Spanish Champions jersey in the Tour de France because he's in the World Champions jersey, but he did win the Spanish Road Race Championship more or less on home soil in Murcia. Jonathan Castroviejo won the time trial. He'll be in the INEOS lineup. What else? Lastly, Alex Howes won the US road race. Tom Scoynes won the Latvian road race, and Alexei Lutsenko won both road race and time trial in Kazakhstan. And Groupama,
my favourite story.
Groupama FDJ, sorry. Stefan Kung won the Swiss time trial, and Sebastian Reichenbach won the road race. So Groupama FDJ will have a couple of national champions in the Tour. Sorry, Daniel.
And I think my favourite story from the round of national championships this weekend was the news that Davide Rebellin has got cold feet about his plans to retire. He basically he'd announced at the start of the season that at 47 years of age he was finally going to call it a day, having turned professional in 1992, and he was going to, he'd chosen the Italian National Championships as his last race, and then he finished on Sunday, and basically said, well, no, I've been having you all on. I've been pulling your leg. I'm going to carry on.
Four more years.
Yeah.
4 more years. 4 more years. Amazing. Just before wrap up the news, a couple of bits of news from us, because if you're going to be in Brussels for the Grand Départ of the Tour de France this weekend, do drop in at the Brussels Beer Project, where we will be on Friday evening. Myself, Richard and Francois. Daniel might make a guest appearance, perhaps. Chiro's hoping to come along as well.
Orla Shinoui maybe too.
And details of that are on our website, thecyclingpodcast.com/live-events. I got the web address wrong last week, but it's live-events after thecyclingpodcast.com. And big news is that we're going to be at the World Championships as well, a live event at the Harrogate Theatre on Friday, September the 27th. Tickets are on sale for that now, and you can find a link to that on thecyclingpodcast.com/live-events.
The fastest clothing in the World Tour, the home of cycling with character. Ride and watch with Rafa in 2019 as they partner EF Education First and Canyon SRAM.
Thank you very much indeed to Rafa, our headline sponsor, and we'll be covering the Tour de France once again with the support of Rafa, for which we're very grateful. We're also hoping to pop into the Rafa pop-up in Brussels on perhaps Sunday morning. So if any of you are around Brussels, Sunday morning we're hoping to call in for a cup of coffee, probably around about 10:30-ish. That's not a solid commitment, but we'll aim for that. Maybe more like 11, actually. Also look out for the EF Gone Racing films during the Tour de France. They'll be making 5 behind-the-scenes shows during the race with EF Education First. You'll find them at rafa.cc or follow Rafa on YouTube. Have a look at the Rafa channel on YouTube and you'll get all the EF Gone Racing films there. So on with the questions. Let's hear the first one, please.
Hi, Stephen from Belgium here. I was calling in to ask you guys who you think will be the hot favorites for the second stage, the team time trial. My bet is Jumbo-Visma because apparently that team must be doing something right because they have three national time trial champions if you count Jos van Emden, who will not be here, but still. It seems that team is somehow kind of a specialist in the team time trial job. What do you guys think? Which team is the best in team time trials and why?
Well, we thought it was good to kick off with a question about team time trial because that's stage 2 this year, and it's a really good question because it's quite open with the absence of BMC. I don't think CCC are going to pick up where BMC left off and do anything in the team time trial. That was a real speciality of BMC. Some feral kids here, Lionel, interrupting us. But yeah, BMC won last year the team time trial, and it's going to be a very important stage. It's coming very early, of course, and should offer a clue as to who's in form. I mean, Jumbo-Visma is an interesting nomination as a specialist because they're having a good season. They're a strong squad. They had a bit of a shocker last year in this stage, this equivalent stage. They were 13th, with, of course, Primoz Roglic and Steven Kruijswijk, who eventually finished 4th and 5th overall, but they have got a strong team, likes of Tony Martin, Wout van Aert. They do have a very strong lineup, and I think Jumbo-Visma are a pretty good shout as outsiders to perhaps win that stage.
I would disagree, Rich. I would disagree. I think they've got two huge engines in Van Aert and Tony Martin. Well, Tony Martin, we're not quite sure, what sort of shade of the former Tony Martin we're going to get these days. He's certainly, his powers are definitely diminishing. But I think Sunweb, if I look at the sort of man for man, as far as the Dutch teams go, I would say Sunweb have a better chance of doing well and certainly of threatening or the likely winners on that day. Kelderman, Matthews, Anderson, Craig Anderson aren't Case, Ball, Haga, Kemner and Roach. I mean, all fairly good time trialists and some quick guys as well, which, can be useful in a team time trial. So I would say they're going to have a very decent team. The other standouts would be INEOS, and I actually do think CCC have got a decent team for with the likes of Bevan. Even Simon Geschke is quite a good time trialist despite his small stature. Roskopf, Mickey Scher as well. And then another outsider, EF Education First, who I think had a training camp or a team time trial training camp or a day at least specifically in Girona last week with Uran, Van Garderen, Lawson Craddock, possibly Taylor Finney. I don't think they've named their team yet, have they?
No, they haven't. They're the last one to name. I did say in my defence, outsider.
Okay.
I think they're a good. Jumbo-Visma are a good outside bet.
How many outsiders
to
are
win
there?
it?
18?
There's 22 outsiders.
The thing about Sunweb don't really. They've got the stage to ride for, but they don't have a lot to ride for. I mean, De Koning, Quickstep are the other team you didn't mention. We should name any possible winner here. De Koning, Quickstep will be there or thereabouts, you would think.
I love the idea of EF Education First team time trial training camp in Girona, followed by burritos and mojitos. Almost certainly.
In sweltering heat as well.
I think Team INEOS and De Koning Quickstep will be first and second on Sunday.
Oh, well, there we go. Next question.
Hello, Cycling Podcast. This is Patrick from the U.S. I have 2 questions here. So it's the 50th anniversary of Merckx's first Tour win, and I think everybody can agree he's undoubtedly the greatest cyclist ever. But in this new era of specialization, what would a rider have to do to be in that discussion for greatest of all time? If someone from this decade won all 5 monuments and all 3 Grand Tours, could they challenge Merckx for the greatest of all time? My second question is, who's currently second on the list of greatest cyclists? Is it Copy, any other thoughts you guys have? I always enjoy listening to the podcast. It's one of the highlights of my week. Thank you, and please keep it up.
Thank you, Patrick, for that question. Really interesting question, actually. You, of course, Lionel, did once ask Eddie Merckx who was the second greatest rider of all time.
Yeah, he didn't answer. He didn't give an answer. The second greatest rider, so far behind him, in his opinion, he couldn't even come up with an answer.
It was one question he'd never been asked. And I mean, I would say Bernardino to answer the second part of the question first. I think Bernardino is probably the second best rider of all time. But that's just my pick. It's a really good question in this era of specialization. What would a rider have to do to be compared to Merckx, or spoken about as a rival of Merckx? Is it even possible? I don't think it's really conceivable that a rider would dominate in the same way as Merckx from the beginning to the end of the season, winning races in all terrains, one-day races, stage races, and so on. But what would a rider? Is it possible that a rider could perform at such a level that we did start talking about him as a rival to Merckx as the greatest of all time?
I think you'd look for that kind of versatility, wouldn't you? Which, by its nature, is kind of unlikely now. I mean, I always feel that as the gene pool in professional cycling becomes more diversified, as we get more and more different nations competing in professional cycling. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we didn't have Kazakhs, we didn't have a lot of British riders, we didn't have a lot of Australians, and so forth and so on. I feel that purely the statistical likelihood of finding someone who is 10% better than everyone else, almost regardless of the terrain, that likelihood is diminishing. I mean, this is something you see, Rich, in women's cycling, isn't it? As the talent pool and the filter, more riders come through the filter, the margins at the top get smaller. So the likelihood of someone being able to dominate every style of racing decreases. Is that fair to say?
I think that is fair to say. I mean, I think Marianne Vos, she's not that old, and I think the last couple of years she's been not far off the level that she was at when she was dominating, and she's not dominating to the same extent now. So it's quite an interesting experiment in a way. There's a rider who, has been around long enough and seen the sport develop around her, and so you can almost measure where she is now compared to where she was then as a sort of barometer of how the sport has developed. Yeah.
So I think that by its nature, the likelihood of a dominant figure is decreasing. But you would want to see, I suppose, that kind of versatility. The most versatile rider of the current generation is probably Vincenzo Nibali, in terms of being able to win classics and Grand Tours, but he's not been able to dominate in either of them, and far from it. He's probably been the second or third or fourth best rider of his generation in the two domains. But you forge those two together, and the result is quite impressive.
The more interesting question for me is, and this kind of comparison of sports people from different eras is sort of pointless. We know that in almost all sports, today's competitors are operating at a much higher level than people 20, 30, 40, and certainly 50 years ago. But what would be really fascinating is for the boffins to get their computers out and calculate where Eddie Merckx's 1969 performance would put him on GC now, 50 years later, taking into account his weight, taking into account the speed that he was riding, taking into account the weight of the bike. I mean, it must be possible to come up with a rough guesstimate. The difference being that the racing was completely different, of course, in terms of style and the way that the Tour was won. But it would be really interesting to know as kind of what sort of physical specimen was Eddie Merckx when compared to the riders today. I mean, a lot bigger, a lot bulkier. So that would be something that I'd be really interested if anyone out there knows how to sort of guesstimate that. I hate speculation, as you know, but
I think he'd be about 15th.
You think he'd be 15th? I think he'd be last.
Oh yeah. Oh, sorry, but yeah, I'm just imagining, how many riders out there now are better than Merckx was then. But you're talking about on his original bike and stuff.
He'd be last. He'd be riding for De Koning Quick-Step, and Patrick Lefevre would be sort of talking outside of his mouth about him being too fat, and needing to lay off the Leffers and the Afflighems. Probably.
There'd be stories in the press about him and smoking at the Ghent 6 day, and it would just all have unravelled.
Someone would be telling him his sideburns weren't very aerodynamic.
But I mean, the one of the sort of fundamental components of why Merckx was so good was that kind of domination feeds domination, and there's an inherent and intrinsic momentum that comes from dominating, because it makes a guy really feel good about himself and feel good about the fact that he's better than everyone else. So as soon as someone does challenge you, then it becomes a whole lot harder, doesn't it? And the key, the sort of the kernel of the Merck story is the fact that he started winning, continued winning, and at that point he couldn't contemplate, didn't want to countenance not being the dominant figure anymore. So he did what he needed to be to stay at the top in every kind of race. And he was sort of haunted by this spectre of no longer being the superior athlete, and consequently his decline was very quick. It was precipitous. As soon as he lost the Tour de France 75, everything sort of turned to sand.
Chute à l'arrière du peloton, cycling podcast team car at the back of the pack, please.
How would you like a case of craft beer? Well, as a listener to the Cycling Podcast, you can get a free case of beer from our friends at beer52.com. Just go to beer52.com/cycling to claim your free case. All you have to pay for is the postage. This is the perfect opportunity to get some special beers in time for the Tour de France. Richard, you've got a can of something nice there. What is it?
You mean this one, Lionel? Give it a wee tap before I open it. This is a Lost and Found beer session IPA, yellow and black. Very snazzy design. It's a black hand over a yellow can. The Jumbo Visma beer, this one, in colour scheme. At least very, very fruity. Grapefruit, tropical fruits. It's got that slightly bitter, grapefruity taste. Very nice. The story behind this beer actually is it's a small brewery from Brighton, Lost and Found, and they apparently were in a bit of trouble, financial trouble last year, and Beer 52, it's in my month's case of Beer 52 beers, but Beer 52 actually own 50% of the brewery now, so they've got them back on their feet, and they are producing very nice beers with very, as I say, snazzily designed cans. So highly recommended, the Lost and Found Session IPA.
So to claim your free case of craft beer and pay just £5.95 for the postage, go to beer52.com/cycling. That's beer52.com/cycling.
Hi guys, Mike in Weybridge in Surrey here. Just thinking about Vincenzo Nibali in this year's Tour, with the absence now of Chris Froome and Tom Dumoulin, is it in Nibali's nature, do you think, to just go for stages and the polka dot as he's previously declared? Or do you think that he simply can't resist now going for GC? Or also, really, do you think that he and the team may have burnt too many matches in the Giro?
Why is it that Nairo Quintana has, some crazy odds according to the bookmakers in winning the Tour de France? Some even putting him at something like 20-1. I know he had a disappointing season last year, but he's still only 29. And this year's Tour de France seems more suitable for climbers than previous editions as well. And not to forget, he's also competing in one of the strongest teams, Movistar, with Valverde and Landa alongside him. So, yeah, how come?
Hey guys, Lucas from Cologne, Germany here. I wanted to ask you specifically about your expectations for the top tier GC guys who already competed on a high level at the Giro d'Italia this year. Like Nibali, Landa, Simon Yates, Sakharin and Mollema. All on team duty and in for stage hunting, or even more than that?
Well, we heard 3 questions there from Mike, Eduardo and Lucas, and can I just say it's great to hear so many questions coming from all over the world. That's very nice to hear indeed. But we've grouped them together because, well, there's this question there about Nairo Quintana, who seems to be sort of under the radar, and then another question about Nibali and some of the other guys who've come out of the Giro. Will they be targeting GC at the Tour, or, as some of them have said, just going for stages? I mean, Quintana, first of all, Lionel, I don't know, it is true that Quintana, though he's still only 29, is not really being talked about anymore as a favourite, as he's an outsider really in this race, and he's going with a strong Movistar team, but 3 potential leaders with Alejandro Valverde and Mikel Landa.
Yeah, I mean, the question was about his odds being as far out as 20-1. I mean, the thing about the cycling betting market is that often the odds are determined by the level of interest from the punters, I think, as much as anything, because, you know, betting being a mugs game, the bookmakers want to cover themselves, don't they? So the thing about Quintana is that it says that the Tour is more suited to climbing, but it looks at so many of the stages look like they're going to be tricky and, you know, difficult to. It's not just going to be a riding uphill contest, I don't think, and I just don't think we've really seen. We haven't really seen Quintana racing in a sort of in a dynamic fashion. Last year, the stage that he won was really a short time trial up one mountain, wasn't it? The grid start, he won that stage, didn't he? And that was a sort of drag test. So he clearly can do it on a given day, but he isn't great at preventing himself from leaking time here and there, and I can't really see it being any different this year for some reason. I don't know. Not a rider that really kind of energises or excites me.
And what about this question, Daniel, of riders who've come out of the Giro? Simon Yates is another one. Nibali is obviously one who's said that he will be going for stages and maybe King of the Mountains and not GC. Is that a bluff? Do you think they'll play it by ear, see how the legs are as the race goes on? There's a bit less time, isn't there, this year between the two races to recover? Because we did see it last year by Dumoulin, who went second in both. What do you reckon?
Well, I think they probably all need to be treated and considered individually. Nibali is very temperamental, as we know, in a good and a bad sense. I think he can show up at the Tour de France and have a certain idea in his head, and if his legs aren't particularly good on one particular day, he can completely flip and he can decide, he can completely revise and revolutionise his plans for the race. As I say, in a positive or a negative sense, he's done that in the Tour before, and I think with him a lot will depend on the first 4 or 5 days. If he finds himself 2 or 3 minutes down on general classification, then he will be very much committing to, well, he'll either be committing to stages and the King of the Mountains jersey, or he'll be committing to going home, basically. But if things do go well and, you know, his team loses less than a minute in the team time trial, then he might start to get interested and he might start to look at the other contenders and think, well, this is it could be quite a soft Tour de France. The big beasts aren't here, and this isn't a last opportunity of a lifetime. Simon Yates, who knows how Simon Yates has come out of the Giro. It didn't go well for him, but we thought even before the Giro, and we asked the question of whether he was undercooked and whether he'd raced enough, and over the 3 weeks, even from within the team, the sort of noises that were coming out suggest that maybe he was undercooked slightly, in which case maybe he'll be fresh enough to go for the Tour and go for general classification, but his chances will hinge maybe a little bit on his brother's chances. If Adam's going well, then Simon will be expected to lapse into, to fall into a domestique's role. And with Landa, I mean, he's got unfinished business in the sense that he wasn't really able to fully pursue his own ambitions at the Giro, despite looking as though he was capable of challenging to win that race. But again, it's the question of the first week with him. I think if suddenly he's 5-6 minutes down, then unless he rides a Tour de France a la Atapuma, as discussed last week, then it's going to be difficult for him. And the others, you know, Zakharin and Mollema, they're very much outsiders, aren't they?
Hello, chaps. This is Emil calling from Copenhagen, Denmark. I would very much like to hear your assessments on 3 points regarding the Tour. Now, first of all, who do you think will be the favorite for the overall win should the European heat wave last for the better part of the tour? Which riders cope well with the heat and which ones don't? Secondly, regarding the immense success that the Astana team have had this year, is it enough, do you think, to take Jakob Fuglsang to the podium, maybe even help him take the overall win? And finally, I would like to know your thoughts regarding the King of the Mountains jersey. Wouldn't you agree that Julien Alaphilippe is the favorite to take that jersey, not since Richard Virenque has there been, in my opinion, such a huge favorite to win it? Thanks for a very pleasant and knowing show. Cheers, lads.
Thanks for your question, Emil. 3 questions, in fact, really. The European heat wave that we're seeing, I was in Madrid at the weekend, it was 42 degrees, really unbearable, and couldn't have imagined riding a bike in that, could barely walk in that. I don't know what the forecast is like. We spoke, I think, last week or the week before about Thibaut Pinot being someone who doesn't like the heat. Chris Froome loves the heat. He's not there, of course, but had the heat wave continued and had he been riding, that would have certainly suited him. Who of the other riders either likes or doesn't like the heat? Do you have intel on this, Daniel?
Well, there are a couple of sort of incidents or examples which would suggest that certain riders don't like it, but they might be isolated and too isolated to constitute a trend or a pattern. For example, Adam Yates last year really struggled in the heat early in the Tour, but that was, well, I think he suffered from heat stroke effectively, and you know, it may be that he's learned a great deal, and he talked a lot last year about it being a mistake and the team having learned from that mistake. So you would presume that in that case a weakness might have become a strength. With Pinot, I think it's more of a pattern, isn't it? You know, he's even talked about, if you get him on a good day, he'll even tell you about his sort of family's genealogy and the fact that his family have lived in the Vosges region for 10 generations, and it gets very misty there and cold, and consequently it's in his DNA. I don't have any sort of strong hunches about the other general classification contenders. What about you, chaps?
I mean, it's difficult to know. You would imagine that Geraint Thomas would maybe struggle more in the heat than, say, a rider who's grown up in Colombia. But that's just an assumption based on...
Is that because he's from the valleys?
Yeah, God. But it's just an assumption, isn't it? I mean, there's not necessarily any basis
kind of
to that.
Fag packet punditry, isn't it?
It is, but is it not also usually a fair assumption that if somebody grows up in quite a cold country, they're maybe going to cope better with the cold? I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, Froome has always loved the heat, hasn't he? And he obviously grew up in Africa, so that that makes sense.
I mean, you grew up in Scotland, Rich, and you cope better than I do.
Maybe a more interesting and relevant question, chaps, is who will cope better with altitude, because that could be a big factor in the last week in particular. You know, this moniker that's been given to the Tour this year of the highest Tour de France ever. I think in 3 days they go over 2,000 meters or close to 2,000 meters 7 times, and you know they'll only be over 2,000 meters for a few kilometers on each day, but those few kilometers could decide the Tour de France. And you know, a guy like Nairo Quintana or you know, some of the other Colombians, Egan Bernal, who were born over 2,500 meters. You know, I think that is a factor, and that's something that the teams think about and plan for. And you know, altitude training has become a more and more important component in the preparation of all the contenders. Yeah, I know that I don't know if we've discussed this already this year, but Astana have spent more time at altitude this year than ever before. They've really upped the ante on that front, and whether you know that's going to be enough to get Fuglsang over the line, I'm not sure.
Well, it links to Emil's other question about Fuglsang. I mean, we spoke about this, I think, last week as well, or maybe 2 weeks ago, that after he won the Dauphiné, that you know, Fuglsang's putting together a season. He's put together a perfect kind of run up to the Tour where he looks the complete rider, doesn't he? And no reason at all in what looks like a very open Tour that he couldn't finish on the podium at least, I think, heading a very, very strong team as well.
Can you chaps see Astana riding in the vein of the teams that have won the Tour? Well, we're basically talking about Sky in the last few years. That sort of defensive riding style of having a guy in the yellow jersey and protecting it by riding a fast pace on the front and deterring the would-be attackers. That's not really their style. Their style is to ride a sort of counter-attacking style, sending riders down the road in a very aggressive style of racing.
Yeah, it's always different though, isn't it? When teams always say that, we won't ride like that, we'll ride differently and we'll be aggressive and we'll be attacking. But when they have the jersey, the best way to defend it is to ride like that, clearly.
And the simplest way. The simplest way,
yes. So I don't think they would make life hard on themselves by riding in a different way. I think if they have the jersey, if Fuglsang is in the yellow jersey in the final week, I think we'll see Astana ride in exactly the way that we've seen Team Sky ride the last few years, or whichever team it happens to be. It's just that a method that certainly it works, doesn't it? And it sort of reduces the variables and makes the racing a bit more controlled and controllable, and that's the whole point.
I suppose what we haven't seen is INEOS or Team Sky ride in the opposite way. We haven't seen that team on the back foot before and having to sort of to break a stranglehold of a leader in another team. I mean, that would be interesting if Bernal and Thomas found themselves 2, 3, 4 minutes down and they had to be the aggressors.
Emil's last point was about the King of the Mountains jersey and Julian Alaphilippe being a red-hot favourite. I'd agree with that, just mainly because there doesn't appear to be a huge number of obvious...
Warren
Barguil was second last year, but a long way behind. A long way behind. I mean...
But he's whimsically flaneuring to good effect at the moment, Napalm. I think he could be a big danger in that competition.
Could his wardrobe cope with the tricolour and the polka dot jersey? I think I'm not sure. But Alaphilippe won a stage in the Alps and the Pyrenees last year. Rafael Majka, who's won the King of the Mountains a couple of times and was a long way behind in third place last year, not riding for Bora Hansgrohe this year. A wee wild card, Giulio Ciccone, who's riding for Trek Segafredo, who won the King of the Mountains at the Giro. A very different type of competition at the Giro, really. The Tour de France competition is one where you can rack up an awful lot of points with a couple of big breaks. It's not quite the same as the sort of chipping away effect that tends to net the jersey in the Giro d'Italia, but Ciccone might have a fair bit of freedom in Trek Segafredo to go in the sort of breaks that Alaphilippe may well find himself going in once the GC has settled down a bit.
I mean, the one thing with that competition as well, ironically, sprinting is quite important in that competition, and Alaphilippe is the best sprinter of those riders. A lot of the time they will be contesting mountains points in sprints, and he will beat the whimsical flaneur and Ciccone, no? Should he not, and Barguil come up trumps, what approach do you think he'll take? If he gets the polka dot jersey, will he wear a straw boater with a half tricolor, a sort of tricolor ribbon, or how will he approach that?
I can definitely see ribbons.
Tricolor socks and King of the Mountains polka dot shorts.
The Cycling Podcast is supported by Science in Sport. Science in Sport. Fueled by science.
Thank you very much indeed to Science and Sport for their support of the Cycling Podcast. And you can still, and throughout the Tour de France, get 25% off all your Science and Sport products with the code SISCP25. Sing it, Lionel. Don't sing it. At scienceandsport.com. That's SISCP25. Noticed there was a picture shared widely on social media, I think it came from Owen Rogers originally, of the contents of Alice Barnes' pockets after she won the National Road Race Championship in Britain at the weekend. Lots of Science and Sport wrappers in there, which she'd very diligently kept to dispose of at the finish. Good for her.
Well, yeah, very good for her. But as she said herself on Twitter, she doesn't feel like she needs commending for taking her litter home with her. She said, if it can come out of my pocket, it can go back in. And I think that is a message that everyone who rides a bike and eats, whether it's energy bars and gels or just a chocolate bar or...
It's a bit like football fans being commended for observing a minute's silence, isn't it? You think, well... Shouldn't they do that anyway?
Yeah.
Anyway, it was good to see that her win in the National Championships was powered by so many science and sport products as well. That was my takeaway from there. A bit of business before we carry on with your questions. Kilometre Zero at the Tour de France. 15 episodes in total, of course, at the Tour de France. One a day, Monday to Friday, throughout the race. Will be supported once again by Hansgrohe, and they supported us last year at the Tour de France and also at the Giro d'Italia this year. Very grateful to Hansgrohe Showers and Taps for supporting a Kilometre Zero and enabling Kilometre Zero to happen at all. We've got lots of ideas. I think there'll be an Eddie Merckx one in there to kick things off, because we start, of course, in Brussels. But yeah, very grateful indeed to Hansgrohe, and we're looking forward to bringing you 15 episodes of Kilometre Zero throughout the Tour de France. And before we carry on another bit of business, Lionel, we're also selling mugs again, Cycling Podcast Limited Edition mugs made by Stacey Snyder, all proceeds going to good causes. We've asked you to nominate good causes. We had lots of nominations again, as we did for the Giro. And once again, we've selected 2 good causes on each side of the Atlantic, one in the UK and one in the US. And in fact, I think the one in the US is pretty local to Stacey. She doesn't know this yet, but I believe it's not too far from where she is based. So the good causes, well, each of these good causes had 2 nominators. Is that
Nominees.
No, they're not nominees. They were people who nominated.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, sorry.
Anyway, we'll look up our thesaurus for that one. Thomas Nelson, and James Doyle. They both suggested the David Carey Scholarship Fund, Star City Cycling. Now, the David Carey Scholarship Fund is a new fund. According to David's mother, there were 3 things that he wanted to do with his life: take care of his family, cure cancer so other kids wouldn't have to go through what he went through, and to get more kids on bicycles. The fund has been set up to provide financial assistance to kids who could not participate otherwise in the Star City cycling activities. So a really good cause, and we're very pleased to support it through the sales of Stacey's mugs. They will go on sale on Saturday during stage 1. I'll give you details of that in a moment. But the other good cause that we're supporting at the Tour de France is the West Lothian Cycle Circuit up in Scotland. Now I know West Lothian very well because I used to work for the West Lothian Youth Theatre, which is a terrific organisation. Well, it's got a new name now, but it serves all the communities of West Lothian, which is an area in between Edinburgh and Glasgow, lots of old mining towns around there. The West Lothian Cycle Circuit is a facility that's being established there with lots of local volunteers involved in the committee and so on, to provide safe cycling facilities primarily for youngsters again. Now, Liz Wisdish nominated the West Lothian Cycle Circuit, as did Matthew Ball. Matthew Ball, I think, is involved in the committee, and he also nominated the West Lothian Cycle Circuit for the Giro. It didn't quite make the cut there, but we're delighted to support the West Lothian Cycle Circuit this time around. He particularly wants the Cycling Podcast money to help raise funds to include a cobbled section so that they can run some spring classics in the early part of the year, which is a nice idea. So the West Lothian Cyclecircuit.org for more information on that. And if you're interested in more information also on the David Carey Scholarship Fund, it's starcitycycling.com/David-Carey, CAREY-scholarship-fund. So yeah, we're delighted to support those 2 good causes. The mugs will go on sale on Stacey Snyder's Etsy site at 9 a.m. US East Coast time on Saturday, or 3 p.m. Brussels time, which is just about when stage 1 will be well underway. You can have a look at the mugs at staceysnyder.com. That's STACYSNYDER.com. Raised over $2,000 at the Giro and hoping to do the same again at the Tour de France.
Hi guys, this is Ali from London. I'm a huge fan of the podcast, so thanks for all your brilliant coverage this year. The Tour de France kicks off on the same day as Pride in London this year. What can be done, if anything, to improve diversity in cycling? And when do you think the sport will progress to the point that a rider in the pro peloton can come out?
Well, thanks for your question, Ali, in London. I mentioned I was in Madrid at the weekend. The Pride March was on there on Saturday. Absolutely thousands and thousands of people, and that's happening in London this weekend. But the question was really about the sport of cycling, which is in common with a lot of sports, doesn't have, to the best of our knowledge, any out male gay cyclists, athletes. And I'm not sure, and this could just be wishful thinking on my part, but I imagine that if a rider did come out, there would be an awful lot of support and goodwill. We saw a couple of years ago now, I think 2 or 3 years ago, Robert Miller came out as Philippa York, having transitioned from male to female, and is now working in cycling as a journalist. And there's been an awful lot of goodwill towards Philippa York and support, from what I can tell. And it's great that she's now working in the sport once again in a different capacity. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what could be done to encourage a rider to come out if they feel like they can't. Oh my goodness, we're just sitting here and we've been delivered two vermouths. Can you tell us exactly what these are, please?
So that's our dry vermouth on tap. It's marjoram kind of flavor. The rosso, it's sweet, bitter. So from vermouth area.
Thank you very much.
We show the Tour de France every day from Saturday.
You can tell them yourself.
Yeah, so we will showcase the Tour de France every day on our terrace. So please come by.
There we are. Thank you. That's very kind. Thank you very much. Sorry, Daniel, you're missing out here. But yeah, I mean, I don't have an awful lot of insight into this, I must be honest. I don't know if either of you guys do. I imagine that if a rider... the thing is that as well, I don't think there's an awful lot of interest in riders' personal lives. Maybe not to the same extent that there is in other sports even. Is that fair to say? I mean, I was just on a tangent. I was chatting to someone last week about Bob Jungels, and I mentioned that I'd seen him with his girlfriend at the airport on the way back from the Giro, and I was told, oh no, that's actually his wife. Bob Jungels is married. Now, no reason to know one way or the other whether Bob Jungels was married or not, but I just thought he's quite young, and I didn't think he was married yet. So I don't know. But there's not. We don't know an awful lot about a lot of the riders' personal lives unless they make them very public on social media and so on.
I'd like to think that it's kind of irrelevant, really, to anyone other than the riders themselves, as long as there is an inclusive culture within the teams and the peloton and the sport itself. And on that front, you would think perhaps a sport like professional cycling, people would feel less reluctant to come out because they're not performing in a stadium where, let's face it, if you're a professional footballer and you came out, you might encounter a negative reaction from potentially thousands of people. That's kind of an uncontrollable that you might not want to subject yourself to the chance of a negative reaction. I would like to think that I would really hope that cycling would be grown up enough, mature enough, and inclusive enough that really the sexuality of riders would be right at the bottom of any list of items of interest about about their personal lives. Really, kind of, but I don't really have any sort of evidence to say that the peloton is open and friendly and inclusive in that regard either. So yeah, it's not something I've probably, to be honest, really thought about.
Well, listen, chaps, we've got a lot of other questions that unfortunately we're not going to have time to get through. Thanks very much to everybody who has phoned in a question, and sorry we can't get to them all. We will be doing 2 press conferences during the Tour de France, 2 press conference episodes on the 2 rest days, and then a final press conference episode to come just after the Tour. So we'll give you plenty of reminders during the race about how to phone in your questions. Anything you're looking forward to in particular this year about the Tour, Daniel?
The cycling, Rich, I think this year
Really, that's not like you.
No, I think it's going to be. It'll be interesting. It'll be a very open race. I'm very curious about how the French riders Bardet and Pinot will fare. I almost pity them in a certain way, and I certainly pity Thibaut Pinot in the sense that I really don't feel that his heart is in the Tour de France. His heart is not in the media circus that's going to be whipped up around him and his chances, particularly if he's going well. I think he'd rather be at the Giro. But if things do work out well for him, I think he's got everything it should take to win this Tour de France. Which would be a fabulous story for everyone if a Frenchman were to win the Tour de France again after, how many years is it since 1986 and 1985, so 34 years now.
85.
Yeah. So I think that'll be really interesting.
As long as it doesn't lead to Francois Thomazeau's retirement. I hope that, Francois having covered the Tour since 86, I hope that, in the event of a French win, they didn't suddenly announce his retirement. That'd be my one little qualifier there.
And I'm also, I'm intrigued to see the sprints and last year there was this question hanging of whether we were going to see a changing of the guard with Groenewegen and Gaviria coming through. We did kind of see it, but we thought that there might be a bit of a last sort of death rattle from Cavendish and Kittel somewhere down the line, and that looks increasingly unlikely. Neither of them are going to be at the Tour this year, so I think what we're going to see as far as the sprints are concerned is the shape of things for the next few years to come, unless that there's someone else sort of waiting in the wings even behind Groenewegen in particular, whether Jakobsen in the next few years or even a Van der Poel might, or a Van Aert might become the next big thing in sprinting. But I think that's going to be interesting to see to what extent Groenewegen really cements his domination of the sprints. And Van Aert himself, I'm very curious to see how much latitude he gets from Jumbo-Visma, whether he shapes up, he looks like Peter Sagan's future nemesis, because he looks to be a similar kind of rider, maybe even more versatile. I'm not looking forward to the food as much, because I spent a week in France at the Dauphiné. I was coming out the Giro, and I was slightly dismayed by the cuisine, by the once famous and the once vaunted cuisine of France.
Yeah, what's gone wrong, really? I mean,
come on, France.
Well, I don't know. We could do endless podcasts on that, Lionel. But
I think it's mainly an economical, economic factors.
It's complacency.
I think there's I always sort of mention this, that the day I knew the game was up was when I ordered a pavé steak in Nice, and it was just a bit of old shoe leather, scored but not quite cut through in the middle and folded over and buried under sauce to give the shape and heft of a nice soft pavé. But it was actually
what you were looking forward to, Lionel, not what you were dreading.
Okay, what I'm looking forward to? I'm looking forward to kind of the Eddy Merckx Fest over the weekend in Brussels. I'm looking forward to our invitation to the Laurent Perrier Champagne House on Monday evening. Rich, thank you very much to David Hesketh for the invitation to sample some champagne. That will be I'm very much looking forward to that. I think you're driving that evening, Rich. I think that's been decided. I'm looking forward to La Planche de Belfi, just because I quite like that climb. I think it's there's something about it that I enjoy. It's a sort of it's not the most charming corner of France, but I do like the way that climb, particularly when it's as early in the race as the first Thursday, shakes things up a bit. I am looking forward to a couple of cassoulet, one in Toulouse and one in Foix, and I'm looking forward to going to the Pont du Gard down in the south, because I remember very fondly a family holiday there when I was about 8 years old.
Well, I'm looking forward to, as you said, Daniel, an open race. I think at some point we will see a French win. It's going to happen, and maybe it could be this year. But what I'm most kind of hoping for, I guess, is that Team INEOS is neutered a little bit in the absence of Froome, that the two leaders they have are strong but vulnerable potentially, and that I hope we don't see if one of those guys, Bernal or Thomas, gets into the lead and Ineos put a stranglehold on the race. It could be just like watching, 5 or 6 of the last 7 tours or whatever it's been, and I hope that the other teams are emboldened by the potential weakness of Team INEOS to really take the race on, because you feel like in the past years there's been a huge sort of element of fear, and teams have not been really willing to take them on. And Lotto NL Jumbo kind of did it a bit last year, especially in the Alpe d'Huez stage. And I hope that teams like that and Astana and
they need to gang up.
FDJ,
they need to gang up and attack. And Daniel's point about Eddie Merckx's the fear factor that dominance sort of conveyed on the rest of the peloton.
So the
the
risk-reward ratio could be slightly different.
Yeah, because I don't think Geraint Thomas was unshakable last year, but the thing that propped him up, if there was to be any sort of weakness, was the fact that Chris Froome was lurking just behind, and everyone knew, whether or not the signs were that he perhaps wasn't as strong, he was still there, still lurking as a danger. And with Froome absent, Thomas and Bernal, they're not the same.
It's not the same proposition.
No, definitely not.
And my other reason for mentioning that, Lionel, was to a good excuse to play a clip of our latest Friends special, Lunch with
Dave Brailsford.
You went off for lunch with Dave Brailsford last week. I listened to your conversation over the last couple of days and I found it really fascinating. Lots of stuff in there I didn't know. You got quite personal with Brailsford on everything from Brexit to what he does in his spare time.
Don't put people off with Brexit.
Not
talk.
A lot is the answer, but it's entertaining and it's quite insightful, and I learned a lot. Let's hear a little clip from it now.
But it's never 100% smooth, I don't think. This time last year we were battling with the ASO about whether Chris could start the Tour de France or not. So that was pretty full on, and we'd had a pretty challenging year with the whole Salbutamol case and Chris's crash to start the Giro, and it all seemed pretty full on, I must say, this time last year, and much less so this time this year, I must say. It's been more disruptive. A couple of things. I suppose bigger picture. In November when Sky said, okay, this is last season, that was changed everything in terms of let's get out there and find some so we can find new owners, which we did, and that transition then happened in May, and we switched mid-season, which was a huge kind of effort by everybody. So then we've been bedding in with our new owners, getting to know our new owners, which has been pretty exciting, I must say, and very, very different culture, very exciting. But in the meantime, I think we've had each one of our kind of main, Egan, Chris, and Geraint have all crashed. Egan obviously crashed just before the Giro, took him out the Giro, which was a blow. But then the whole team bounced back, and Pavel did a really, really good performance. It was a shame to lose Teo, but I was very, very pleased with that and the energy that gave us all, really. And then Chris's crash was unexpected, out the blue. It really did come immediately. It was a phone call. Didn't really. I missed a call from Tim Kerrison, who was out on a course when it happened. It was obvious immediately that he'd had a really bad crash. There crashes and there's crashes, isn't there? Straight away when it's a bad one. And so that was actually pretty traumatic, I must say. I think it took its toll on the human side, and the whole team was shocked. The group was shocked, and for the guys who were at roadside with Chris at the time, I think that was a pretty harrowing experience for them. Obviously we had Chris, Geraint, and Egan all thinking about the tour, and as Chris was no longer going to be available, then of course for Geraint and Egan that changed the situation slightly. So went over there, and then Geraint crashed, obviously, and took him out the race. And however, Egan performed, very, very. It was a very assured performance, I think, which kind of now leaves us in a situation where, all things being equal, we go into the tour with Egan, who's come back, raced well, Geraint, who's training very, very well and definitely in good condition, but maybe hasn't had those climbing stages to really test his form. So that's how we just deal with what we got. All in all, I'm I'm actually pretty excited, I must say.
Well, lunch has arrived, Dave, so we should eat it before it gets cold.
So that's Lunch with Dave Brailsford, available to friends of the podcast this week. It's coming out imminently. Also available this week will be the July episode of the cycling podcast Feminat, which is really a look ahead to the Giro Rosa, which begins on Friday. We've got interviews in there with Annemiek van Vleuten, the defending champion, and favourite again this year, and Ashley Moolman-Passio. And we'll have a rider keeping a diary from the Giro Rosa as well, and we'll give details of that a bit later on, but very excited about that, and it should be able to enable us to cover that race better than we've been able to in the past. So that's coming out this week too. We should wrap things up though for now. Thank you very much, Lionel.
Thank you, Richard.
And Daniel, you're off covering the Tour for ITV, of course, again, but hopefully you'll be able to join us on the podcast from time to time.
Yeah, don't forget my contact lenses.
What?
Remember, this is a time-honoured tradition.
Have you sent them to me?
Is that contact? No, I'm all right.
No, not this year. All right, excellent, good. Worried.
Rich, I still have your bracket for your GPS, your phone in your car. I will give that to you in Brussels.
Oh, well remembered, Daniel. That's fantastic. Well, we'll liaise in Brussels. Looking forward to Brussels and a couple of quite easy stages from a logistical point of view. From a logistical point of view, and that they start and finish in Brussels. So looking forward to that. But that's all for now. Thank you, Lionel.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.